The ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum glittered with crystal lights and polite laughter, but Naomi Joseph stood there feeling invisible. Rick's hand rested on her shoulder like a claim, not a comfort, guiding her from one donor to the next, as if she were a piece of the gallery's art. When she spoke, he interrupted. When she smiled, it was to protect his image. Then her daughter, Layla, tugged at the hem of her silk gown. Her voice was barely a breath. "Mommy, Daddy has a lover. I heard them. They're going to take all your money." Naomi's heart stopped, but her face did not change. Across the room, Rick laughed loudly, a man already acting like he had won. Moments later, Rick leaned in close, murmuring a command disguised as a joke about the family's foundation accounts. A subtle reminder of who held the keys. Layla slipped something small into Naomi's palm. A plain white hotel key card. Naomi closed her fingers around it without looking. No tears, no scene. Just the quiet understanding that the man she loved had turned her life into a trap. This was the moment Naomi Joseph stopped being unaware and started being dangerous. Dear viewers, this is the story of Naomi Joseph, a woman who was hunted in her own home, both figuratively and literally, only to discover that the man who claimed to be her protector was the architect of her destruction. It is a story of how a single, whispered warning from a daughter intended to save her mother became the very spark that burned down a mogul's empire. Hello family, welcome back. Before we begin, I have a small but heartfelt request. Please subscribe. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. Every time you click that button, you're helping us share voices that would otherwise be forgotten. Voices like Naomi's, and stories that prove silence isn't a sign of weakness, but a place where a plan is born. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. Because together, we are not just telling stories. We are keeping the truth alive and ensuring that no woman ever has to feel invisible in her own life again. The ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum was a cavern of shimmering light and curated perfection, a space designed to reflect the absolute success of the men standing within it. Naomi Joseph adjusted the weight of her diamond necklace, feeling the cold bite of the metal against her skin. Beside her, Rick was in his element. He moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of a king, his hand perpetually anchored to Naomi's shoulder. To any observer, it was a gesture of affection. To Naomi, it felt increasingly like the heavy hand of a warden ensuring his prize remained in its designated place. And of course, Rick said, flashing a blinding smile at a group of tech investors, the foundation wouldn't be half as successful without Naomi's aesthetic touch. He squeezed her shoulder, a silent command to smile, to agree, to remain the beautiful, silent partner in his grand narrative. He didn't mention that she had spent 80 hours that month overseeing the logistics of their latest youth initiative. In his world, she was the aesthetic, the decor that made his ambition look like altruism. When Naomi tried to add a detail about the program's impact, Rick laughed, a warm, boisterous sound that effectively cut her off. "She's always so modest," he said, steering her toward the next group of power brokers. "But we have a budget to discuss, don't we? The accounts are a bit of a maze this quarter, but I've got it all under control. I always do." The air in the room felt thin, saturated with the smell of expensive lilies and the underlying scent of Rick's arrogance. It was then that Naomi felt the sharp, insistent tug on the hem of her silk gown. She looked down to see Layla. At 7 years old, her daughter had eyes that saw too much, a quiet observer born of a household where the loudest voice always won. Layla didn't ask for a drink or say she was tired. She leaned in, her small face pale against the vibrant colors of the gala. When she spoke, her voice was a ghost of a sound, meant only for Naomi's ear. "Mommy, Daddy has a lover. I heard them in the study yesterday. They're going to take all your money. They said you won't have anything left." The world didn't tilt, it froze. Naomi felt the blood drain from her extremities, leaving her fingers numb and her heart hammering a frantic, hollow rhythm against her ribs. She looked across the room. Rick was standing near the bar, throwing his head back in a laugh that seemed suddenly monstrous. He looked powerful, untouchable, the architect of a reality she was only just beginning to realize was a cage. Her daughter's hand moved quickly, slipping something into Naomi's small, beaded clutch. It was a practiced, desperate movement. "He's coming back," Layla whispered, her eyes darting toward her father. Rick approached them, his gaze sweeping over Naomi with a clinical sharpness. "Is everything okay? Layla, you should be with the sitter in the lounge. You're looking a bit peaked, Naomi. Don't tell me you're having one of your episodes again. You know how you get when there's too much excitement." The word episodes hung in the air like a threat. It was his favorite tool, the subtle suggestion that her perception of reality was flawed, that her emotions were a liability only he could manage. He reached for her bag, his fingers brushing against hers. "Let me take that for you. You look like you're about to drop it." "I'm fine, Rick," Naomi said, her voice sounding like it belonged to someone else, someone far away and incredibly calm. She stepped back, tightening her grip on the clutch. "I just need a moment of air. The room is a bit crowded." "Don't be long," he murmured, his eyes narrowing. "The senator is arriving in 10 minutes. I need you by my side. Remember who handles the optics here." Naomi nodded, her face a mask of serene compliance that she had spent 10 years perfecting. She guided Layla toward the ladies' lounge, her mind racing. She found a private stall, stepped inside, and clicked the lock. With shaking hands, she opened her clutch. Layla had given her a hotel key card. It was plain, white, and unadorned by any logo, the kind used by boutique establishments that prize discretion above all else. It was still warm from being hidden against her daughter's skin. As Naomi held it, a faint, unfamiliar scent drifted up, a heavy floral perfume that didn't belong to her, and certainly didn't belong in their home. The card felt like a jagged piece of glass in her hand. It was the physical evidence of a life being dismantled in secret. Rick wasn't just stepping outside the marriage, he was erasing her. "They're going to take all your money." Layla's words echoed against the marble walls of the restroom. Naomi realized then that the administrative cleanup Rick had been mentioning lately, the new passwords he'd set for the security of their joint accounts, and the way his legal team had started hovering around their personal assets weren't signs of his meticulous nature. They were the opening moves of a siege. She looked at her reflection in the gilded mirror. The woman staring back looked like the perfect wife, diamonds at her throat, hair swept into a flawless updo, a picture of black excellence and marital stability. But behind the mask, the aesthetic was gone. She slid the key card into a hidden pocket of her bag and took a long, steadying breath. She would not cry. She would not storm back into the ballroom and demand an explanation that he would only twist into more proof of her instability. Rick expected an emotional eruption because that was the only weapon he believed she had. He expected her to be loud, to be hurt, and to be easily managed. Instead, Naomi Joseph walked back into the glittering light of the gala, found her husband's side, and placed her hand back on his arm. She felt him relax, the victor reclaiming his prize. She smiled when the senator arrived. She thanked the hosts for the praise meant for her husband, and she played the part of the well-dressed accessory with terrifying precision. But as the city lights slid across the windshield of their town car on the drive home, and Rick complained about the incompetence of his subordinates, Naomi didn't listen. She watched the shadows of the skyscrapers, her fingers tracing the outline of the white card through the fabric of her bag. The gala was over. The mask was still on, but the game had changed. She was no longer a participant in his narrative. She was the architect of her own. The drive home from the gala was a symphony of Rick's ego. The cabin of the luxury SUV filled with his sharp critiques of the evening's donors and his boastful predictions for the next quarter. Naomi sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded neatly over the clutch that still held the plain white hotel key card. She kept her gaze fixed on the passing streetlights, offering the occasional non-committal hum of agreement. To Rick, she was simply tired. To herself, she was a woman realizing she had been living in a house of mirrors. When they arrived at their sprawling suburban estate, the security system chirped with its usual, high-pitched efficiency. Rick tapped his code into the keypad by the door, and the heavy mahogany double doors clicked open. "I'm going to the study to finish those emails for the morning meeting," he said, not looking back. "Don't wait up. You look like you're fading." Naomi watched him walk away, his silhouette receding into the darkened hallway. She headed upstairs to check on Layla, finding her daughter already tucked in by the nanny. Naomi sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of the child's chest. The weight of Layla's warning pressed against her ribs. "They're going to take all your money." The realization began to take physical shape when Naomi retreated to her dressing room. She reached for her tablet, intending to check the household's shared calendar and the grocery budget, mundane tasks that usually anchored her. When she swiped the screen, the device prompted her for a password. She entered the 4-digit code she had used for 3 years. Incorrect password. She tried again, her fingers trembling slightly. Incorrect password. Account locked. Contact administrator. A cold sweat broke out across her hairline. She tried her phone next, attempting to log into the Joseph Family Foundation portal. The screen spun for a moment before a notification appeared. Access restricted. Your permissions have been modified. Please contact Rick Joseph for assistance. It wasn't a glitch. It was a lockout. She stood up, her heart hammering. She needed to see the banking app, the joint savings account that held the inheritance from her grandmother, funds she had always assumed were protected by the sanctity of marriage. She navigated to the login screen. This time, the app opened, but the balance was a staggering 0. A series of transfers, all executed within the last 48 hours, had drained the account into a trust titled RJ Consulting LLC. Naomi felt the room begin to spin. She looked up, trying to catch her breath, and her eyes landed on the small, black dome of the security camera tucked into the corner of the ceiling. Rick had installed them 6 months ago, citing a string of neighborhood break-ins. He had called it a perimeter and internal safety net, insisting that only he handle the monitoring to save her the stress of managing the tech. She stared at the lens. It didn't look like protection anymore. It looked like an unblinking eye. She began to walk through the house, her footsteps silent on the thick rugs. She noticed them everywhere now. In the kitchen, the hallway, even the corner of the living room. They were positioned at perfect angles to capture every exit, every entrance, and every conversation. She realized with a jolt of terror that her husband wasn't guarding the house from the outside world. He was guarding the house from her. He was tracking her movements, timing her routines, and perhaps even listening to the very moment Layla had whispered the truth to her. She returned to her bedroom and sat in the dark, the blue light of her locked phone the only illumination. She looked at the hotel key card again. The betrayal was complete. It wasn't just another woman. It was a systematic, architectural dismantling of her autonomy. Rick had spent months quietly building a wall around her, brick by brick, while she had been busy being his aesthetic touch at galas. The silence of the house felt predatory. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the central air, felt like it was reporting back to him. She realized that any move she made from this point forward would be watched. If she packed a bag, he would see it. If she made a phone call, he might hear it. She was trapped in a digital cage of her own husband's design. She looked at her reflection in the dark window. The fear was there, but beneath it, a cold, hard resolve began to crystallize. If the house was under surveillance, then she would give him exactly what he expected to see. She would be the quiet, tired, slightly confused wife. She would be the woman who couldn't remember her passwords, the woman who was fading. She would let him watch her, but she would stop being the person he thought he was looking at. As the security system chirped again downstairs, the sound of Rick finally moving from his study, Naomi slid the hotel key into the hollowed-out lining of her jewelry box. The silent lockdown had begun, but for the first time in years, Naomi Joseph was the one holding the most dangerous secret in the room. The house breathed with a mechanical rhythm, the low hum of the climate control system masking the silence of a home that had become a battlefield. Naomi sat at her vanity, the mirror reflecting a woman who appeared to be performing a nightly skincare routine. She moved with practiced grace, applying creams and serums, knowing that the black dome of the camera in the corner was recording her every gesture. To Rick, watching from his tablet in the study, she was merely a wife winding down from a long evening. He saw the routine. He did not see the revolution. Beneath the vanity sat her old laptop, a relic from her days as a freelance consultant before the marriage had swallowed her professional identity. Rick had once mocked it, calling it a clunky antique, but its age was now its greatest virtue. It wasn't synced to the house's mesh Wi-Fi. It didn't share a cloud with Rick's high-speed servers. To access the world beyond the walls Rick had built, Naomi didn't use the home network. Instead, she used a burner hotspot she had hidden weeks ago in an old diaper bag at the back of the closet, a small precaution she'd taken when Rick's administrative cleanups first began to feel like subtractions. She opened a private browser and navigated to an old encrypted email service she hadn't touched in years. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of silk and lace. She entered a password Rick couldn't possibly know, her mother's maiden name combined with the date of her first solo art exhibition. The inbox loaded slowly. Buried beneath years of spam and old newsletters was a notification from 6 months ago, flagged by an automated security alert. It was a notice from a secondary banking institution they had used for their first mortgage. One Rick had claimed was closed. The alert indicated a new authorized signatory and a primary email reroute. Naomi felt a cold chill settle into her marrow. She began to trace the digital breadcrumbs. Rick hadn't just changed passwords. He had built a parallel financial universe. Using her digital signature, likely forged or captured during one of those quick sign here, honey moments at the breakfast table, he had established a corporation, RJ Strategic Holdings, LLC. The initials were a taunt, a signature of his narcissism. As she dug deeper, the maze Rick had joked about at the gala began to clarify. Every month for the last year, large sums had been transferred from their joint investment portfolio into RJ Strategic. From there, the money moved again, vanishing into a series of smaller consulting fees paid to an offshore account. The amounts were staggering. Funds intended for Layla's trust, the equity from the sale of Naomi's family land, and the dividends from their shared tech stocks. She saw a PDF attachment titled Final Distribution Plan. Her breath hitched as she opened it. It wasn't a business plan. It was an exit strategy. It detailed a timeline for the total liquidation of their joint assets, set to be completed within the next 30 days. Most devastatingly, she found a draft of a letter addressed to a private family law firm, outlining a history of emotional instability and financial negligence on her part, to be used as grounds for sole custody. Rick wasn't just leaving. He was erasing her existence and taking her daughter as a final trophy. Naomi didn't cry. The time for tears had ended at the gala. She reached into the drawer and pulled out a small, silver encrypted thumb drive, the kind she used to use for client backups. One by one, she began to download the evidence. She saved the transfer logs, the forged signature documents, and the damning PDF. The light of the screen was a cold, blue fire in the dark room. Each file that clicked into the drive was a brick in the wall she was building to protect herself and Layla. She knew the risks. If the Wi-Fi hotspot flickered, or if Rick decided to walk in for a glass of water, the game would be over. She worked with the precision of a jeweler, her eyes darting toward the bedroom door at every floorboard creak. When the last file was copied, she ejected the drive and tucked it into the lining of a hardcover book on her nightstand. A dense biography of a forgotten statesman that Rick had often joked was too boring for her to ever finish. It was the safest place in the house, hidden in plain sight within the one thing he didn't value: her intellect. She shut down the old laptop and hid it back beneath the vanity. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark silhouette of the trees against the moonlight. Downstairs, she heard the heavy thud of the study door closing and Rick's footsteps on the stairs. He was coming to bed, confident, powerful, and entirely unaware that the invisible woman he had been monitoring was no longer there. Naomi Joseph was still wearing the silk nightgown he liked, but she was already miles away, armed with the truth and a plan that Rick's surveillance would never see coming. The following morning, Naomi moved with the synchronized precision of a woman who knew she was being filmed. She dressed in high-end athletic wear, humming a song she didn't particularly like, and kissed Rick on the cheek as he obsessed over a Wall Street Journal headline. "I'm doing a double session at the Pilates studio, then a long lunch with Chloe," she said, her voice light and airy, the perfect pitch of a woman with nothing on her mind but calorie counts and social calendars. Rick didn't even look up. He merely grunted, a sound of dismissal that Naomi now cherished. It meant his arrogance was still intact, and as long as he was arrogant, he was blind. She drove her car to the luxury gym, parked in her usual spot, and walked through the front doors. She greeted the receptionist, scanned her membership card, and walked straight through to the back exit that led to a secondary parking structure. Waiting there was a nondescript silver sedan she had rented 2 days prior using a prepaid card. By the time she reached the downtown district, the high-gloss world of the Josephs felt like a distant, flickering television screen. The law office of Marcus Thorne was located in a building that whispered rather than shouted. There were no gold-plated nameplates or sweeping views of the harbor. It was a suite characterized by heavy oak doors and a receptionist who didn't look up when Naomi entered. She had used her maiden name, Naomi Williams, to book the consultation regarding estate planning. When Marcus Thorne stepped into the room, he didn't offer a patronizing smile. He was an older man with sharp, weary eyes that had clearly seen the dark underbelly of perfect marriages. Naomi didn't waste time. She reached into her bag and placed the encrypted silver drive, the hotel key card, and a printed list of the siphoned assets on the desk. "My husband is Rick Joseph," she began, her voice steady and clinical. "He has already begun the process of locking me out of our shared existence. He is documenting my instability via the home surveillance system, and he has moved roughly 60% of our liquid assets into a shell company called RJ Strategic Holdings. I need a firewall." Thorne picked up the hotel key card, turning it over in his fingers. "In cases of coercive control and high-net-worth asset stripping, the first move is often the final move," he said. "If he files for divorce or a mental competency hearing before we have our ducks in a row, he can freeze your access to everything, including your daughter, under the guise of protection. We have to move into what I call the protocol." He stood up and pulled a thick, blank ledger from a shelf. "From this moment on, you are a forensic observer. You do not argue. You do not confront. You do not show him you know. Every time he denies you access to an account, you write down the time, the date, and his exact words. Every time he suggests you are forgetful or unstable in front of a witness, you record it. We are building a narrative of intentional psychological and financial abuse." Naomi watched as he mapped out a strategy on a legal pad. It was a cold, mathematical counteroffensive. He explained the process of discovery, a legal mechanism that would eventually force Rick to open his digital books under penalty of perjury. But until that day, Naomi was to be a ghost in her own home. "We need a separate, untouchable nest egg," Thorne continued. "Small, incremental withdrawals from the household accounts. Nothing large enough to trigger an alert. Cash back at the grocery store, small consulting, checks for your old business that we can reroute. We need to establish a physical safety plan for Layla. If he senses the shift, he will use her as a tether." Naomi nodded, absorbing the instructions. The fear that had been a cold lump in her throat since the gala began to transform into a sharp, metallic resolve. She wasn't just a victim of a cheating husband. She was a participant in a high-stakes corporate raid where the company was her life. Thorne handed her a small, burner phone. "No cloud syncing. No Wi-Fi. Only use this when you are away from the house or in a dead zone you've identified. We communicate through a secure app. If you see him looking at your primary phone, let him. Let him see the mundane emails. Let him think the cage is still secure." As Naomi drove the rental car back to the gym, she felt a strange, quiet power. She was no longer just Naomi Joseph, the aesthetic touch of a billionaire's portfolio. She was an operative. She returned to her SUV, checked her reflection to ensure her makeup looked like she'd just finished a workout, and drove home. When she walked through the front door, the security system chirped its familiar warning. She looked up at the camera in the foyer and offered a small, tired smile. She knew Rick was likely watching the feed from his office, checking her arrival time against her stated schedule. She took off her shoes and headed toward the kitchen, where Rick was pouring a glass of wine. "How was Pilates?" he asked, his tone dripping with the bored indulgence of a man who thought his wife was an expensive hobby. "Tiring," Naomi replied, her voice perfectly modulated. "I think I'm getting a bit forgetful, though. I could have sworn I left my water bottle in the car, but it wasn't there." Rick chuckled, a sound of pure, condescending satisfaction. "I told you, Naomi. You've been scattered lately. Maybe you should take those vitamins the doctor suggested. You wouldn't want to lose your head entirely." "You're probably right, Rick," she said, leaning against the counter. "I don't know what I'd do without you to keep track of things." As she turned to reach for a glass, her eyes caught the reflection of the silver drive hidden in the pocket of her gym bag. The protocol had begun. Rick was busy celebrating her supposed decline, entirely unaware that every patronizing word he spoke was being added to a ledger that would eventually become his cage. Naomi Joseph wasn't losing her head. She was finding her weapon. The days that followed were a masterclass in the art of being seen without being known. Naomi moved through the house with a curated listlessness, leaning into the scattered persona Rick had so generously constructed for her. She knew that every time she stood staring blankly into the pantry or misplaced her car keys, Rick was watching the playback on his iPad, likely sharing a smug chuckle with his consultant, mistress, over how easily Naomi was unraveling. But beneath the surface of her performative exhaustion, Naomi's mind was a cold, humming engine of audit and observation. She began by mapping the blind spots of the house, the few inches of space where the camera lenses couldn't pivot or where the high-definition microphones were muffled by the white noise of the HVAC system. She discovered that if she sat on the floor of Layla's walk-in closet, tucked behind the rows of winter coats, she was effectively invisible. This became her sanctuary. There, in the muffled darkness, she used the burner phone Marcus Thorne had provided to log her husband's routines. Rick's behavior, once seemingly spontaneous, now revealed itself as a series of rehearsed maneuvers. He had a specific way of checking his watch before taking business calls on the terrace, calls that Naomi now knew were status updates on the siphoning of her grandmother's estate. She watched him through the kitchen window, noting the way his body language shifted when he spoke to his lover. He looked younger, more animated, the predatory edge of his personality softened by the thrill of the heist. He wasn't just having an affair. He was falling in love with the version of himself that was successfully stealing a fortune. The most chilling discovery came when Naomi conducted a digital audit of her own primary phone. She had noticed that the battery drained rapidly, and the device often felt warm to the touch, even when idle. Using the instructions Thorne had sent to her burner, she navigated deep into the system settings, past the standard menus. There, hidden behind a generic-looking system update icon, she found the Parasite, a high-level stalkerware application. It gave Rick real-time access to her camera, her microphone, and every keystroke she made on her primary device. It explained how he always seemed to know who she had texted and why he had been so confident in her forgetfulness. He was likely deleting her calendar invites and reminders remotely to gaslight her into believing she was losing her mind. A wave of nausea hit her, but she forced it down. She couldn't delete the app. To do so would be to tip her hand. Instead, she began to feed the Parasite a diet of carefully crafted misinformation. She used her compromised phone to search for symptoms of early-onset memory loss and natural remedies for anxiety. She sent a text to a friend about how overwhelmed she felt with the upcoming school fundraiser. She allowed Rick to see exactly the woman he wanted her to be, a broken, confused liability. Meanwhile, she observed his administrative maneuvers with the clinical eye of a forensic accountant. She watched him through the reflection in the microwave as he hovered over her shoulder while she checked the mail, waiting for specific bank letters that never arrived. She realized he was intercepting the physical mail before the nanny or the housekeeper could get to it. One afternoon, while Rick was working from home in the study, Naomi stood in the hallway, just out of range of the camera's motion sensor. She watched him through the crack in the door. He was holding a stack of papers, documents she recognized as the deed to her family's summer cottage. He was practicing her signature on a scrap of paper, his tongue poking out in concentration, a chillingly mundane image of a man erasing his wife's heritage. The sight solidified her resolve. The man she had shared a bed with for a decade was a stranger, a digital ghost who had haunted her life long before she realized the door was locked. She returned to Layla's closet, pulled out her burner phone, and typed a message to Thorne. He's practicing the forgery now. The deed is next. How much longer? The reply was instant. Stay the course. Let him think the surveillance is working. We need him to feel so safe that he becomes reckless. The more he documents your decline, the more evidence we have of his premeditated fraud. Naomi tucked the burner phone back into its hiding place and stepped out of the closet. She smoothed her hair, adjusted her expression into one of vague confusion, and walked into the study. "Rick," she asked, her voice trembling just enough. "Have you seen my blue folder? I could have sworn I left it on the console." Rick didn't even look up from the papers he was hiding beneath a blotter. "You're getting worse, Naomi," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced caress of poison. "I'll look for it later. Why don't you go lie down? You look like you're seeing ghosts." "Maybe I am," Naomi whispered, turning away so he couldn't see the flash of fire in her eyes. She wasn't seeing ghosts. She was becoming one. And soon, she would be the one haunting him. The house felt unusually still when Naomi returned from picking up Layla from school. The air didn't carry the usual sterile chill of Rick's absence. Instead, the scent of expensive cedar and roasting lamb drifted from the kitchen. Rick was home early, standing by the kitchen island with a bottle of vintage Bordeaux already decanted. He looked like the picture of a devoted husband, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a soft, rehearsed warmth in his eyes that Naomi had learned to fear more than his coldness. "You're home," he said, stepping forward to press a lingering, performative kiss to her forehead. "I realized we've been drifting, Naomi. The stress of the foundation, the gala. I haven't been the husband you deserve. I wanted tonight to be a fresh start. Just the two of us, after Layla goes to sleep." Naomi forced her muscles to relax, offering a weary, grateful smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's very thoughtful, Rick. I think I'd like that." She played the part of the relieved wife, the woman desperate for a sign that her world wasn't actually crumbling. Throughout the dinner, Rick was a phantom of the man she had married. He reminisced about their honeymoon in Amalfi. He poured her wine with a steady hand, and he listened, truly listened, to her mundane stories about Layla's art class. It was a flawless performance, a poisoned olive branch, extended with surgical precision. But Naomi noticed the way his gaze flickered toward the security camera in the dining room corner, Every time he steered the conversation toward her mental well-being. He wasn't just talking to her, he was creating a record for the unblinking eye. "I've been worried about you, Naomi," he said, his voice dropping to a low, concerned register as he reached across the table to cover her hand with his. "The forgetfulness, the way you seem to lose hours of the day, even the staff has noticed. I spoke with a colleague, Dr. Eris Thorne, no relation to your lawyer, of course, who specializes in high-stress cognitive fatigue. I've taken the liberty of setting up a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation for you tomorrow morning." The air in the room seemed to vanish. Naomi felt the trap snap shut. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a move to have her legally declared unfit. If she refused, he would use the footage of her irrational refusal as proof of her decline. If she went, he likely had the doctor in his pocket, ready to sign whatever observation Rick required to trigger a guardianship or a custody grab. "An evaluation?" Naomi asked, her voice small, trembling with a fear that was only half feigned. "Rick, I'm just tired. I don't need a psychiatrist." "That's exactly what someone in your state would say, darling," he replied, his grip on her hand tightening, just a fraction too much. "It's out of love. I've already moved the primary household management over to my personal assistant to lighten your load. And since you've been so scattered with the finances, I've redirected the dividend deposits to the RJ strategic account for safekeeping. You shouldn't have to worry about numbers right now." He was confessing his crimes under the guise of care, documenting her incapacity in real time. Naomi looked down at her plate, her mind worrying. She needed to survive this dinner without providing him with the hysterical outburst he was clearly fishing for. She thought of the burner phone in the closet, the ledger Marcus Thorne was keeping, and the hotel key card hidden in her jewelry box. "If you think it will help," she whispered, leaning into the role of the broken woman, "I'll go. I just want things to be back to the way they were." "That's my girl," Rick said, a flash of genuine triumph crossing his face, the look of a man who had just cleared the final hurdle in a long race. He poured himself more wine, his confidence restored. He began to talk about a business trip he had to take the following day, a quick overnight in the city. Naomi knew what that meant. He was going to the hotel. He was going to celebrate his victory with the woman who was helping him steal Naomi's life. Later that night, after Rick had fallen into the heavy, satisfied sleep of the predatory, Naomi retreated to the bathroom. She turned on the shower to create a wall of steam and noise, then pulled her burner phone from its hiding spot. She messaged Marcus Thorne. "He's forced a psychiatric referral for tomorrow. Dr. Eris Thorne. He's also mentioned safekeeping the dividends. He's moving fast." The reply came a minute later. "Do not miss the appointment. I know Dr. Eris. He's reputable, which means Rick is trying to manipulate a neutral party. I'm sending a private investigator to the hotel Rick mentioned. We need the physical proof of the lover to dismantle his narrative of the devoted, worried husband. If he's at that hotel while you're at a psych eval he forced, the intent becomes a weapon in our hands. Stay calm. You are the sanest person in that house." Naomi tucked the phone away and stepped into the hot spray of the shower. She leaned her head against the tile, let the water wash away the touch of Rick's hand, and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would sit in a doctor's office and be poked and prodded for signs of madness. She would let them look. But while Rick was watching her through a camera, and a doctor was watching her through a lens of science, Naomi would be the only one watching the clock. The olive branch was poisoned, but she had already found the antidote. The appointment with Dr. Eris went exactly as Marcus Thorne had predicted. Naomi had been a portrait of grounded, weary clarity, answering the diagnostic questions with a level of composure that made Rick's claims of erratic episodes look like the desperate fabrications they were. By the time she walked out of the clinic, she knew the doctor's report would not be the killing blow Rick expected. It was instead the first light of dawn. While Rick was entrenched in his business trip at the boutique hotel, Thorne struck. He didn't file for divorce, not yet. He filed a targeted, high-priority discovery request tied to a potential breach of fiduciary duty regarding the Joseph Family Foundation. It was a surgical strike, a legal lever that forced Rick to open his digital archives before he realized the trap had even been set. Because Rick had used the Foundation's servers to manage some of the administrative cleanup for RJ Strategic Holdings, his private communications were no longer private. 2 days later, Naomi sat in Marcus Thorne's office, the air smelling of old paper and the sharp tang of printer ink. Marcus slid a thick stack of papers across the desk. "We have them," he said, his voice devoid of triumph, replaced by the grim satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered the wolf. He didn't think anyone would look at the metadata. He thought he was too smart to be audited. Naomi looked down at the first page. These weren't just bank statements, they were the intent emails. The primary thread was between Rick and a woman named Elena, the financial consultant he had introduced to the board months ago. The exchanges were a chilling map of malice. "She's becoming a liability," Rick had written in an email time-stamped 3 weeks before the gala. "The unstable narrative is taking root. The more she questions the account access, the more confused she looks to the staff. By the time we move the final 40% into the offshore trust, she'll be too drugged on the meds Eris will prescribe to even know the house is being sold." Elena's reply was even colder. "The shell company is ready. Once the guardianship is signed, I'll handle the transfer of the Georgia land. She'll have the minimum allowance the court permits for an incapacitated person. Layla stays with us until the boarding school papers go through. Make sure the cameras catch her episode tonight." Naomi felt a strange, cold vibration in her chest. It wasn't heartbreak. She had moved past that long ago. It was the thrill of a predator realizing they were actually the one being hunted. Rick hadn't just been cheating, he had been architecting her total destruction. He had intended to steal her sanity, her heritage, and her child, all while playing the role of the grieving, supportive husband. "The metadata shows these were sent from his office during the gala," Thorne explained, pointing to the timestamps. "While he was standing next to you, holding your shoulder, he was hit sending on the transfer that emptied your grandmother's trust. This is premeditated fraud, Naomi. It's racketeering and coercive control. What happens next?" Naomi asked, her voice like a sharpened blade. "Next, we turn on the light," Thorne said. "We file the supplemental motion for an emergency freeze on all assets, including RJ Strategic. We present this evidence of intent to the judge. But more importantly, we notify the Foundation's board. He's been using their reputation to wash the money. Once they see these emails, he won't just lose you, he'll lose his kingdom." Naomi stood up, the weight of the last few months suddenly lifting, replaced by a terrifying, beautiful clarity. She thought of the hotel key card, the poisoned dinner, and the way Rick had smiled at her when he thought she was broken. He had underestimated the woman he had tried to erase. He had thought her silence was a sign of weakness, never realizing that she was simply waiting for the light to be bright enough to show the world exactly who he was. She walked out of the office and into the bright afternoon sun. For the first time, she didn't look for the cameras. She didn't check her phone for trackers. She didn't need to hide anymore. The truth was no longer a whisper in a ballroom. It was a legal record, a forensic certainty, and a promise of justice. She drove home, pulled into the driveway, and looked up at the house. It was still a cage, but the bars were melting. Rick was still inside, sitting in his study, likely planning his next move. He didn't know that the light had already been turned on, and that in the coming hours there would be nowhere left for him to hide. The shift in the house was immediate and visceral. Rick's arrogance, once a smooth and impenetrable armor, had begun to crack under the pressure of the legal freeze. He had been served the papers in his office, a temporary restraining order, and a complete freeze on the RJ strategic accounts. And for the first time in 10 years, Naomi saw him lose his composure. He didn't come home that evening. Instead, he sent a flurry of texts that oscillated between desperate pleas for communication and veiled threats about her instability. Naomi didn't respond. She sat in the silent kitchen, watching the security feed on her burner phone, seeing the man who had tried to erase her finally realize he was the one being phased out. But a cornered predator is most dangerous when its territory is shrinking. The next afternoon, Naomi's burner phone buzzed with an alert she had set up with Layla's school. It was a geofence notification. Rick's car had entered the school zone 20 minutes before the final bell. He wasn't supposed to be there. The school had been provided with a copy of the emergency filing that morning, but the administrative gears moved slower than a man in a panic. Naomi felt a surge of cold adrenaline. She knew Rick's mind. He was losing the money, he was losing the foundation, and he was losing his reputation. Layla was the only leverage he had left, the only way to force Naomi back to the negotiating table. He wasn't acting out of love, he was acting out of a need to possess. She didn't call him. She didn't scream. She drove. As she pulled into the school's circular drive, she saw Rick's black SUV idling near the side entrance. He was standing by the heavy glass doors, his face a mask of frantic, rehearsed charm as he spoke to the young receptionist. He was likely using the concerned father routine, claiming there was a family emergency or that Naomi was unwell, and couldn't make the pickup. Naomi stepped out of her car, her movements calm and deliberate. She caught the eye of the school's security officer, a man she had spent months greeting with genuine kindness. She pointed toward Rick and then toward her phone, where the digital copy of the court order was ready. "Rick," Naomi said, her voice cutting through the humid afternoon air like a piano wire. He spun around, his eyes wide and bloodshot. The perfect husband was gone. His tie was loosened, his hair was disheveled, and the predatory confidence had been replaced by a wild, jittery desperation. "Naomi, thank God. I was just telling them. There's been a misunderstanding with the accounts. I need to take Layla for the weekend. We need to talk, away from the lawyers." "There is no misunderstanding, Rick," Naomi said, stepping between him and the door. "And you aren't taking her anywhere. You're not well, Naomi. Everyone knows it," he shouted, his voice cracking, drawing the attention of other parents. He reached for her arm, his fingers clawing at her sleeve. "I've documented everything. The forgetfulness, the episodes. You can't do this to me." It was the final rehearsed maneuver, but the audience had changed. The parents weren't donor-class sycophants. they were witnesses. The security guard stepped forward, his hand resting on his belt. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from Mrs. Joseph. She's crazy," Rick screamed, his face contorting into something unrecognizable. "She's been hiding things. She's trying to ruin me." In that moment, the unstable narrative he had carefully built for months collapsed under the weight of his own public meltdown. He was the one shouting. She was the one standing in silent, unwavering dignity. He was the one reaching out in aggression. She was the one protecting the perimeter. While the security guard escorted a cursing, struggling Rick toward his vehicle, Marcus Thorne was already appearing before a judge in a hushed courtroom downtown. The emergency motion was no longer just about money. It was about the physical safety of a child and the documented intent of a man who had proven he would weaponize his own family to cover his crimes. Thorne presented the forensic evidence, the GPS logs of Rick's movements, the recorded threats from the previous night, and the discovery of the boarding school documents Elena had prepared. The judge didn't hesitate. The temporary order was converted into a permanent injunction. Rick was barred from the property, barred from the accounts, and granted only supervised visitation under the strictest of conditions. By the time Naomi led Layla out to the car, the black SUV was gone. The school parking lot was quiet again. Layla gripped Naomi's hand, her small face searching her mother's for a sign of the world they used to know. "Is Daddy okay?" Layla whispered. Naomi buckled her daughter into the seat, smoothed her hair, and looked her in the eyes. There was no more mask, no more aesthetic touch, and no more fear. "Daddy is going to be away for a while, Layla," Naomi said softly. "But we are safe, and we are going home. A real home this time." As she drove away from the school, Naomi looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The invisible woman from the gala was gone. In her place was a mother who had survived a siege, a strategist who had outplayed a predator, and a woman who had finally reclaimed her name. The strike had been desperate, but the defense had been absolute. The ground was no longer shifting. It was finally, gloriously solid. The weeks that followed the schoolyard confrontation were not marked by the explosive drama the neighbors expected, but by a steady, methodical reclaiming of ground. The investigation into Rick Joseph moved from the heated arena of emotion into the cool, gray world of procedure. Forensic accountants combed through the RJ strategic accounts, untangling the web of shell companies and offshore transfers with the clinical detachment of surgeons. Because Naomi had documented the intent so thoroughly, the emails, the forged signatures, the timestamps that overlapped with his public performances, the legal walls didn't just close in on Rick. They solidified into a fortress he could no longer penetrate. The consultant, Elena, vanished long before the first deposition, leaving behind a trail of digital breadcrumbs that led straight back to Rick's personal authorization. Without his mistress or his money, Rick's grand narrative of Naomi's instability withered. The public, who once saw him as a pillar of the community, now looked away when his name appeared in the legal notices of the morning paper. He was no longer the smartest man in the room. He was a man caught in the very surveillance web he had spun for his wife. The house, once a sprawling cage of cameras and hidden microphones, had been purged. Naomi had hired an independent security firm to sweep every room, removing the black domes and the parasitic software that had monitored her every breath. The silence that remained wasn't the heavy, predatory silence of a lockdown. It was the quiet of a clean slate. On a Tuesday evening, Exactly 1 month after the gala, Naomi stood in the doorway of Layla's bedroom. The late afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, casting long, golden streaks across the floor. Layla was napping, her breathing deep and even, her face finally free of the watchful, adult anxiety that had shadowed her since the night of the whisper. She looked like a child again, protected not by a claim of ownership, but by the fierce, quiet love of a mother who had fought a war in the shadows to keep her safe. Naomi walked to the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea. She sat at the mahogany table where Rick had once tried to force her to sign away her life. Her tablet sat before her, but this time the password worked. The accounts were no longer zeroed out. The family land was secure. The administrative cleanup was complete, but the results were far different from what Rick had planned. Her burner phone buzzed, a message from Marcus Thorne. The final assets have been repatriated. The board has officially removed his name from the foundation. It's over, Naomi. She set the phone down and looked out the window at the garden. The security lights didn't flicker with the movement of trackers anymore. The cameras were gone. For the first time in 10 years, Naomi Joseph was not being watched. She was simply living. She realized then that her greatest victory wasn't the return of the money or the public fall of the man who had betrayed her. It was the restoration of her own voice. She was no longer an aesthetic touch or a liable party. She was the architect of a future built on truth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Naomi went back upstairs. She leaned over Layla and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. "We're okay," she whispered, not to the room or to a recording device, but to the soul of the daughter who had started it all. The story that had begun with a terrifying whisper in a crowded ballroom had ended in the most powerful way possible, with a quiet, certain peace. Naomi stood, turned off the light, and walked out of the room, leaving the door open. Not out of fear, but because she finally had nothing left to hide. Dear viewers, so, what do you think? Did Naomi and Layla get the justice they deserved? Could you have stayed that calm, standing under the unblinking eye of a camera in your own home, knowing the man smiling at you was planning to erase your very existence? What makes someone a real protector? Is it the one who provides the gilded cage, or the one who builds the silent firewall to break free? Drop a comment and let me know. And tell me, have you ever had to be your own Naomi? The one who stopped reacting and started observing, who turned a surgical eye toward a betrayal and moved with precision instead of anger? Or have you been a Layla, the one who whispered the truth because you saw what the adults were trying to hide? We all need to find that inner strength when the ground starts to shift, the kind that allows us to play the part of the docile observer while we're secretly gathering the forensic truth in the dark. If you were gripped by this story about a mother's surgical counteroffensive, about a daughter's brave whisper in a glittering ballroom, and about a woman who proved that precision is more powerful than a shout, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. I post new high-stakes domestic thrillers every day, and you don't want to miss the next time a perfect mask begins to slip. Like this video if you want more stories about quiet brilliance, about women who outplay the predators in their own homes, and about mothers and daughters who rewrite the rules of survival when the Wi-Fi is cut and the accounts are drained. Your likes tell me you crave more stories about real, unbreakable resilience. This is Blissful Stories, where power is found in the protocol, not the performance, where a single hotel key card can shift fates, and where the best victories are the ones your enemy never sees coming. Until tomorrow, remember, You don't have to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes all it takes is one whisper, one encrypted drive, and the quiet understanding that it's finally time to turn on the light.